Greetings, students. Mr. Little here, and today we're going to have a look at Chapter 29, Part 1. That is the origins of the Industrial Revolution. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Mr. Little, we just went through like 4 revolutions. Another one? And I sympathize with your sense of fatigue with revolution, but trust me, this one's going to be different than the other ones. So let's have a look. Before we get started, however, there are 2 essential questions you will be able to answer by the end of this presentation. Question number 1, how does the Industrial Revolution represent a fundamental change in the chronology of human history? Bonus points for continuity. Question number 2, how did various ecological, political, economic, and cultural factors all come together to see the Industrial Revolution begin in Great Britain in the 1750s? With these 2 questions out of the way, let's talk about what exactly was the Industrial Revolution. So, Encyclopedia Britannica has a very long multi-page definition that can be broken into 10 parts, which I have listed here. And if you'd like to go ahead and read that, that's fine. I'm not going to read that with you, though. If you'd like to pause the video and read this, that's okay. I'm going to give you the short version. What is the Industrial Revolution? But before I do that, let me ask you a question. Pause this video and look around your room or wherever it is that you're watching this video from. Do you see anything in sight that either you made by hand or someone else made by hand for you? I'm looking around and I can only spot 1 or 2 things, okay? That is the Industrial Revolution. That is us literally surrounded by things that were produced by machines in factories or somebody else that we purchased from them. That is, in essence, the Industrial Revolution. It is the world in which we buy things, we don't make things. So the Industrial Revolution has 3 main components to it. Component number 1, human use of land and resources becomes more efficient. This is in part due to the use of resources to power machines versus human muscle or animal muscle, and the organization of labor in a more efficient manner than had previously been done. Part 2, major social, cultural changes. Our lifestyles, living standards, work habits, relationships to political power, and economic power began a gradual but fundamental shift to the world that we are living in today. Part 3, and this is a little bit outside of the realm of a history class, but nonetheless is really important. Most humans begin to adopt a new material worldview of nature, the cosmos, and our relationship to these ideas. Arguably, that was probably happening even before the Industrial Revolution, but it really helped speed it up and solidify it. So these 3 big changes are arguably the features that make up the Industrial Revolution. One other thing I like to show students, however, is these 4 charts to demonstrate the impact the Industrial Revolution has had on the world around us. So this chart number 1, this is the world population over the last 12,000 years. Notice that it shoots up around the time of the Industrial Revolution. This is life expectancy of women in the last 180 years. Notice how it went from about 49 years all the way up to 88 to 90 years. That's the highest that life expectancy has ever been. CO2 levels in the atmosphere. I don't have to tell you much about global warming, but where we find ourselves currently is a direct result of the CO2 that we have pumped into the atmosphere as a result of the Industrial Revolution. And finally, the increase in population, but also the increasing number of urban individuals, people living in cities, is outnumber the people not living in cities. And it's estimated that that number will only continue to decline as the years go on. And we might be down to something like only 1/4 of the population not living in cities by the end of the 21st century. So the Industrial Revolution is a fundamental shift in human history. And I encourage you, as you go through your history courses, to take a look and see how things were different after the advent of industrialization versus before the advent of industrialization, to notice that fundamental change. Let's talk about why Great Britain. Now, the Industrial Revolution begins in Great Britain, but why? Why does it start there? Well, there's a lot of factors, and we're going to run through them very quickly. One of the things you need for an Industrial Revolution is you need more people than you already have. You need a surplus labor force. And thankfully, the British Empire provided ghost acres, that is, extra farmland for the British Isles, which allowed it to sustain a higher population than it might have been able to otherwise. This is called breaking the nitrogen cycle, which were the historic limits on population growth based on how much the land could produce. If you have acres from somewhere else that can supply you with food, it doesn't matter how small your island is, you can definitely have a large population. Second big thing for Great Britain would be accumulated wealth. We talked a little bit last chapter about how Great Britain was able to defeat Napoleon and was able to stay roughly free of the revolutionary waves of France, as well as the revolutions of 1848. This made it a very stable place to keep your money. right? It also meant that it had a wealthy merchant class. If you think about the slave trade and the East India companies in units 3 and 4, right? This meant there was a large merchant class in England, in addition to people who have set up banking institutions to lend money to the government. All this accumulated wealth is going to lead to investors. You also have political protections. You might remember that English history is pretty much all about limiting the government, limiting the power of the king. Combine this with the ideas of John Locke, who explicitly said he wants the ideas of private property protected. You have a society with an atmosphere that will protect any technological advance and allow a person to profit off of it. Now, this leads me to an interesting question. Was the scientific revolution necessary for the Industrial Revolution to happen? Some historians, like Mark Roberts, have said no, it was not. Most inventors historically were not scientists. They did not practice science in any way, shape, or form. They tinkered with things until they came up with amazing inventions. However, I would make the case, and I'm sure other historians probably have made the case too, that the scientific method as it was being formulated at the time allowed for faster development of industrial products once those industrial products had been made the first time. Make the machine go faster. This is possible with the scientific method that came out of the scientific revolution. So why else? Well, as it turns out, Great Britain was blessed with lots of coal and lots of water and river canals, which made it possible to transport said coal or to dig coal out of the ground. Thankfully, that coal was very close to the surface. As you can see from this map here, Great Britain was in a good position to take advantage of this coal as a resource to industrialize. Remember how I said the Industrial Revolution is a shift from animal and muscle power to stored energy. Coal is the first example of that. It is a store of energy that is released upon its burning. Now, I've talked a little bit already about how the colonies provided food that could be consumed, but the colonies also provided other potential resources, such as palm oil, as well as new markets, which would encourage people to industrialize so that they could sell their goods to those markets. So the British Empire, it's very helpful in many ways. Also, population growth, a cause and a consequence. So one of the things that was happening right before the Industrial Revolution is sometimes called the scientific agricultural innovations, seed drills, land enclosure, that is allowing people to privately experiment with crops on their land, selective breeding. All of these things together help to boost the English population, right? And with the English population being grown, you have the rise of cities, you have the expansion of the Royal Navy, which is going to protect the British Empire and its supply of resources. You also have a future labor force, large numbers of people being forced off their land by enclosure, now living in the cities, who could potentially serve as a labor force for your new industrial factories. All of these factors put together made it more likely that Great Britain was going to undergo an industrial revolution first. Now, that is not to say that this was predestined. If you think about it, any of these factors being missing or some sort of great disruption to any of these factors meant the British Isles may not have been the first place to undergo an industrial revolution. So it's very important when we talk about the Industrial Revolution and the massive changes that come after it, it is contingent upon all of these facts. All of these facts do not make it predestined. It's always something to keep in mind about history. So let's talk a little bit about the early industrial movements. That is the movements towards mechanization of production. So it always starts with the textile industry, as you're going to see going forward. And the issue with the textile industry, that is weavers and loom operators, was that in England, the price of labor was high, almost 5 times higher than it was in, say, Delhi in India. Right? And the Calico laws, which had banned the import of South Asian textiles, removed a cheap alternative. So the drive was to find labor-saving devices that could potentially lower the cost of producing goods. And then there was a bunch of inventions powered by water, powered by steam. Essentially, by the 1830s, the British textile industry, that is the production of cloth, was completely mechanized. And you might remember that previously the putting out system had entrepreneurs going out into the countryside and paying women to produce things that they then sold in the city. Well, now instead of the women producing things in their own home, they went into a factory and worked on a machine and produced these goods, which then the entrepreneurs were still able to sell. So much was produced that textiles became a major British export, one of the largest. Its low cost and ease of replacement made it very attractive in foreign markets. And so textile was really the first step on Britain's road to mechanization of most of its industries. It's also worth noting that some of these mechanization processes resulted in an increase in the production of metals, such as iron, via the use of coke, which is a superheated form of coal, which burns hotter and longer than just regular coal, and it allows a higher quality of iron to be produced and more of it. Marco Polo actually described the use of coke in China during the Yuan dynasty, although he talked about it being used to heat baths for long periods of time. In the mid-1800s, a process known as the Bessemer process was even more effective in burning out impurities that normally reside in iron to make a high-quality, durable metal that we commonly call steel. The textile industry begins the mechanization process at the same time inventions in the iron production process means that Industrial Revolution is well underway in Great Britain. Now, one of the things we always associate with the Industrial Revolution is railroads and factories. So how do we get to the railroads? Well, it's called the Newcomen engine, and it was used to pump water out of a coal mine. Now, the nice thing is because it was at a coal mine and it relied on coal, it could just be fueled from the mine. James Watts, who is mostly associated with the steam engine, improved upon this existing Newcomen engine design, made it very profitable. The Watts engine would be the one that would power some early factories, including the Soho manufacturing, which you can see here on the right. But it's really not until you get this Scottish tinkerer named George Stephenson who decides, what if we took the steam engine, put it on wheels, and put the wheels on a track? And so we get the first steam engine on a track. This gradual development is what leads to our modern conception of railroads, which are going to revolutionize transportation, moving of goods to and from factories, moving of workers to and from factories, moving of natural resources to and from points of shipping and production. Railroads are going to change everything. And so it's early on in the Industrial Revolution that they are developed, in part using some of that new energy that we talked about, new sources of energy. Now, the other thing we usually think about when we think about the Industrial Revolution is the factory. And the factory really ought to be thought of as a system. A factory is a place of production, but the factory system represents a shift in how labor is organized. Instead of having everybody out in the countryside doing their own thing, we bring all the labor into one place, and everybody does one specific task. This is the division of labor. The assembly line would come in the 20th century, and this would be made possible by the development of interchangeable parts in the 1800s, which made it possible to very quickly replace, repair, and create new machines. All of these factors put together created what we might call the factory system, which meant there was a very rapid increase in the production of specific goods. It is worth noting that we have seen some features of this factory system prior to the Industrial Revolution. Chinese porcelain production during the Song, Yuan, and Ming dynasties also seemed to mirror a factory system. It had a very specialized division of labor. Slave plantations in the Caribbean also had a division of labor, and something that might have even resembled an assembly line in the way they processed sugarcane to be later sold, as well as textile workshops in Bengal also seemed to resemble a centralization of labor because they brought weavers together in one single place to produce goods. So while the factory system is part of what makes the Industrial Revolution so revolutionary, it has precedents outside of the European system. One of the factors that makes the Industrial Revolution so interesting is the fact that it started in one place, but then went on to affect the entire world. And this leads to an interesting question, which is, why did it happen in Great Britain? Didn't other places around the world have things like natural resources like coal? Didn't they have wealthy merchant classes? Didn't they have large internal markets they could have sold goods to? The answer is yes, and each situation is different. So let's take a look at three of the places that seemed like they might have been set to have an industrial revolution, but did not. In South Asia, Bengal, specifically what is now Bangladesh and parts of India, the high efficiency of agriculture meant that the price of food was so low that the labor force did not have to be paid very much. And this allowed for textiles to be shipped from Bangladesh all the way to Europe and still have them be cheaper than the textiles produced in Europe. This is also that centralization of labor I was talking about. We know that there existed large warehouses full of spinning machines known as charkha, which if you've ever seen that famous picture of Gandhi, this is what he's spinning, his own homespun. That's on a charkha wheel. There was even a company set up by an English investor and the Tagore family in Bengal to promote manufacturing, Tagore and Company. However, unfortunately, a combination of regional political instability and the East India Company, which began to tax weavers so heavily that they couldn't make a living anymore, led to the decline in the production of textiles that South Asia had produced. In the Islamic world, specifically the Ottoman Empire, it's been described by several historians that they faced somewhat of a high-level equilibrium trap, which is that they already produced everything they needed, and therefore there was no incentive to create new machines. And why would you bother to develop factories, to develop new industrial goods when you could just buy said industrial goods from the industrial powers? This is going to have long-term consequences for the Ottoman Empire. And finally, there's the famous one of why not China? Why didn't China have an industrial revolution? And it seems obvious considering China's industrial might being on display and very obvious in the early years of the 21st century. This question is so perplexing, it actually has a name. It's called the Needham question, named after a professor of science named Joseph Needham, who wrote a book about why China did not undergo an industrial revolution. As early as the Song dynasty, China had the ingredients necessary for an industrial revolution. Things like localized markets for buying and selling goods, efficient agriculture meant more food for all and a surplus population. There are documents that demonstrate semi or fully mechanized production of iron, textiles, porcelain, which include things such as the division of labor and the centralization of work, as can be seen from this excerpt of a manuscript over here from the Ming Dynasty. If Imperial China had a number of these factors, why no Industrial Revolution? There's a couple factors that played against the interest of having China undergo an Industrial Revolution. One was the actually historically low taxes that the Chinese government had levied on people. It was actually seen as bad government policy to have taxes that were too high. But the result was that there was no desire by any financial elite or merchant elite to invest in industrial technology that could create a greater return for their money or establish any kind of banking institutions. And therefore, there was no capital available for any up-and-coming entrepreneur to potentially create an industrial factory or an industrial workforce. Additionally, the heavily Confucian Chinese elite class tended to look down on merchants and wealth accumulation. Additionally, the concept of women actually leaving the home and going to a factory to work would have been very, very much looked down upon in a Confucian society. Now, while there was a population boom in China under the Ming Dynasty and the early Qing Dynasty, these peasants did not go to the cities. These peasants instead migrated to other agricultural lands in Mongolia, in Xinjiang, in what we now call Manchuria. And so the cities didn't see a large influx of laborers that could potentially be a future industrial labor force. By the 1830s, this peasant migration had brought great ecological stress that without any sort of overseas colonies to assist them via ghost acres, there was no way to grow the population any further or create some sort of excess labor force that would eventually lead to industrialization. So for all of these reasons, and it's a very good question to ask, China did not undergo an industrial revolution. That is not to say China did not remain an industrial powerhouse. It's worth noting that Great Britain, whose population never even reached 50 million during the 1800s, only surpassed the total production value of China in the late 1800s, almost 100 years after the Industrial Revolution began. To a certain extent, size and population as an indicator of economic prosperity and power was still going to be relevant even 100 years after the Industrial Revolution had begun. So I want to thank you for joining me. You should definitely be able to answer those first two questions from the beginning of the presentation. My name is Mr. Little, and I'll see you next time. Hey there. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this video was able to help you. If you appreciate this kind of work, please like and subscribe. And of course, I welcome any kind of feedback or suggestions, so feel free to leave a comment down below. Thanks so much for joining me. I'm Mr. Little, and I'll see you next time.